Cool, so let's start off by taking a quick tour of the animations available at Animate.css. So if you visit the website, it's really clean and simple. You can actually just open up this drop down box and see all the animations that are available. And if we scroll down, you can see A, there's a lot to choose from, and B, that they're sort of categorized into three main categories, and that's attention seekers. So if we take a look at one, the bounce or the flash. So attention seekers you'd sort of associate with interactions that take place on the site, whether it be a click, a form submission, or if you're using JavaScript, it might be something that's on success or on error. You can assign these to it, even alerts as well. And then the other broad categories we've got are entrances and exits. So if we look at the bounce in, the bounce out, fade in left, fade in right, and it's sort of just a different keyframing style that's applied to each of these sort of subcategories of, you know, bouncing, fading, whatnot. These flippers as well. Rotating. So you can see there's a lot of options available, and you can see how this translates to a lot of sites you may have seen, especially professional landing pages. So if you've got a landing page, and you might notice when you load, we can undertake a page load here, you've got content that sort of animates in or out, as well as when you scroll down a page. Obviously you can't scroll down on this site. As you scroll down a page, the page, you might have content slide in or out. So if we find it in here, fade in left, fade in right. This is something that you see a lot when you're scrolling down landing pages or marketing pages. Another common one is applying these bulk animations. If we look at the fade, when you are in a single page application, and when you change the URL, rather than being a full complete page reload, a section of the page might animate, and they control that. Obviously the framework behind the scenes is controlling the page change, but you will have the animation usually from actually Animate.css on top of that then controls the animation or how the page appears as it loads. So before we dig into the Animate.css file, I thought it would go on a quick tangent. May not be that quick, but we're going on a tangent anyway, that we'll look to clarify just what a CSS animation is, the difference between a CSS animation and a CSS transition, and we'll go through a quick example of building the minimum requirement for a CSS animation, so that way we can gain a bit of a foundational understanding. So when we actually do look into the Animate.css file, we can understand better how it works, and it's put together well, but having a bit of baseline knowledge will allow us to, I guess, use this file to the best of its ability. So let's go. I think the simplest way to distinguish between a CSS animation and a CSS transition is a CSS transition can only transition between two states, so a beginning state and an end state, whereas an animation can actually, I guess, animate or transition between multiple states, and you can define as many states as you like within keyframes. So keyframes is something we'll be touching on shortly, but most other properties that you code in CSS are the same. So I guess if we look at the rubber band example here on Animate.css, you can see, if we do it again, that there's actually multiple states. So this is using 3D transforms, but it's not going from state A to state B. You can see it's going in, out, in, out, in, out, and that's all assigned via keyframes. So let's kick on to the example. With our example app, I thought I'd rather than doing just the one animation, I thought I'd do two, or DOS animations. Now, touching on what I mentioned before about the marketing or landing page style animations, where you might have elements moving within it. So what we'll do is your typical style of an app demo here, sliding up on the background, and we'll also apply a little scale animation to the background. I'm starting with a blank HTML5 boilerplate file, but rather than get into the specifics now, I'll just get on with the code, and we'll touch a specifics and the file makeup when we actually look at importing the Animate.css file. So let's kick it off. So we'll just be using a header element, and within that we'll be storing this background image. So because I want to apply a scale animation to this, I don't want the animation to apply to all of the content within the header. I just want it to apply just to this image. So we have to separate these nodes. So we'll save that, and if we go here, header, we'll just apply a height of 650 pixels, position relative view, not so much. We'll do background green, my favorite background color, as everyone will know. That's just so I can obviously see what's going on, but within that we will store the background, and we'll position this absolute, and left -50 pixels. Now the reason I'm doing -50 pixels on the top, left, right and bottom is I want it to be on all dimensions, want it to be 50 pixels bigger than the container, so that way when we scale it down, so we'll initially start with a scale of this image is at probably 1.2, so it'll be about this size, and then when we scale it down, hopefully it will marry up with the edge of the container there. If not, we might need to tweak it, but that's essentially what we're going to be doing. If we apply, we'll do that in a second. We do the background now. URL. URL. And we'll just go grab the URL. Copy, paste. Size of cover. Position. Center. Save that, and look at that. Now one thing we want to do is apply the overflow hidden here, and you should see that this will shrink up. Watching, look at that. That's exactly what we're looking for. So now we've got the background here. We need to apply the animation. Now this will error out, but what we want to do is do at keyframes. We'll do this, call this scale. No, we don't want that crappy autocomplete. So with from sorry, I'll just type this out, then I'll talk through it. Scale 1. So what we want to do is, now without going into exactly how, all the possibilities with keyframes, what we're essentially doing with this animation is just assigning 2 states. So the starting position will be from scale, transform scale 1.2, and then the ending state will be transform scale 1. So we want it to start big and shrink down to normal size. Now with the animation, we assign that name to it. So this will then, by applying the keyframe name to the animation, that then assigns these keyframe properties to this element. So to get a animation working, we need a duration. Let's do 1 second, and because I'm using live reload, we'll just do duration count infinite. Whoops, I just noticed there I had the semicolons there, so I just removed those, so you can see a scale animation's working well there. So If I get rid of this iteration count infinite, if I reload the page, so right here we've demonstrated the minimum requirements for an animation. So we've got the name, which refers to the keyframe. So when you look at keyframes, the minimum requirement for keyframes is a from state to a to state, so a beginning and an end. You can obviously have a lot more states within here, but you'll change that from a from to a 0%, and then you can have like 25%, 50%, 75%. And what that basically does is it breaks the duration down into a percentage or a proportion of the total animation. So you're saying at 25% of the way through the 1 second animation I want to apply these properties, and so on and so on. But we can see here, just for demonstration purposes, we'll apply infinite and we'll do direction alternate. Now the alternate direction doesn't really, you wouldn't use that unless you're using infinite transitions. So again, I'm just using this for demonstration purposes, but another thing we want is a timing function, and we'll do ease in. So while we're here, we might as well touch on the both. So these are essentially all the 6 properties that you would mainly use for animations. So obviously we've covered the name, the duration, the iteration count. You can say how many iterations it goes through. Actually, I forgot a delay as well. 2 seconds. You can see there, as soon as I reload the page, it waits 2 seconds, so 1, 2, and then that's a little demonstration of what the delay property does in terms of it only delays for the first iteration of the animation. So you can see that it waited 2 seconds, applied the first keyframe, last keyframe, and then it just constantly iterates over these if you apply the infinite iteration count. And of course I've got the alternate direction as well, so it basically goes from to, then to, from to. But I guess the takeaway from this is that you can't have a delay in between each iteration. You have to do that via JavaScript. Now fill mode's sort of an interesting one. It's you have forwards, backwards, or both. They're your options to choose from when assigning property to fill mode, or an attribute, sorry. And what both does is that from before the first keyframe, so say for example you've got a delay of 2 seconds, the element will inherit or use the from state, as well as once the animation's finished, it will use the to state. So it's a bit difficult to explain, but that basically says what properties from the keyframe the element will inherit, I guess either side of the animation. Within that we'll bring in the image, source, and then we'll just target the image here. Let's make it a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit more. 380. Here we go. Right, and below this we'll do our little keyframes called slide up, and we'll do from transform translate y. We'll do 200 pixels. Don't actually know what value we should be using. We'll just put a trial and error. 2, 0, and again we'll minimum requirements here. Animation name slide. Oh, that autocorrect didn't help me out at all. Duration, let's try and match the duration of 1 second, and delay 1 second, and might do the same timing function as well. Timing function is in. Actually, let's do a bit more of a delay there. Now that is fill mode. Rearing its ugly head, I suppose, because I haven't declared it. So, excuse me. As I said, because I'm applying a delay, it's basically treating the elements declared properties rather than any of the keyframes. So what we want to do is, for the whole duration of this delay, we want fill mode. I think it's forwards. Oops. No. Backwards. Opacity 0. We'll add a little bit of opacity to that, so that way it doesn't look so rigid. Oh, look at that. And actually the background's kicking up a stink as well because we removed the fill mode. There we go. So you can sort of see let's make that negative 100 pixels so we get a bit more of a movement. Aha. Now you see we can, because let's get into the end of this keyframe here. This is actually, a good on the road example of fill mode. So we're getting past this end keyframe here. After the duration, you can see that little kickback to the declared position because we're using top here. So it's basic and position relative. So it's going back to its end state. So what we'll do here is we'll change this to both, and hopefully this should do. Oh, look at that. Let's ship it. That's professional. Yeah, so hopefully you guys got a bit of a taste for the animation property. We haven't really touched on the transition, but we'll see if we have time, and we might do that at the end. But yeah, quick little example on the animation property. And now we'll dig into the Animate.css file and see how they use the class names and how they manage state. So let's go. So now that we're all pros from the previous example, we know we've got a thorough understanding of the CSS animation property. We'll look into the Animate.css file and see how it all works and operates. So I'm back at the website here, and I've just clicked on the download link, got the download, and just dragged it into code editor, which is Atom. Now this is a compiled CSS file, so we've got all the vendor prefixes, and we all know that it's 2016 now, so you never hand type vendor prefixes, but they are always present in output CSS, so we'll just disregard those for now. But I guess there's two key classes that are used. So Animate.css is a class-based animation system, which we'll look at very shortly on the actual source site itself. But you can see here that on the animated property, so for any element that we want to animate, we'll assign the animated class, which contains the default duration and the animation fill mode. So we can, based on our previous example, we know that animation duration is a minimum requirement property, so we need that, as well as the animation name, or that references the keyframes. This fill mode is just a safe keep property, as so we don't encounter issues like we just encountered before. And to actually get the relevant animations working, you then add another class, which is, if we can find it in this file, I think, so the structure of the file goes, we won't touch on infinite now. These are a few custom durations for the different animations, but you can see they're defining all the different keyframes here. So you'd have, say for example, the bounce animation. You've got the keyframes defined, and as you can see, they're quite complex keyframes, and you wouldn't want to have to do these yourself. So they've actually got the timing functions embedded in the keyframes, and that's just, I guess, how it gets those the movements as well as the timing. And then at the actual animation name, we have, or sorry, the class name of the animation name, we have the animation name there. And then it just also assigns a transform origin, which I guess is sort of outside the scope of this tutorial, but if you know anything about transform and transform origin, then this is where this ties in. So if we go back to the actual source site here, if we dig into, I'll just get rid of the downloads. If we dig into the actual element itself, it can be a bit confusing. I think it's this one here. I'll just click. It's the span element. So by default, it doesn't have any of the animation classes. So it doesn't have bounce, and it doesn't have animated. Now the reason it does this is because it's got JavaScript in the background that's essentially waiting or listening for the animation end event, then removing the class names. But if we slow, so I'll just go into the animations tab within the Chrome debugger tools, and I'll slow the animations down to 25%. If I click the button here, you will see bounce and animated have been added as the class to the span element. Bounce, animated. As soon as the animation's finished, JavaScript's listening for the event, bang, and removes the classes. So I guess this leads into how class-based animations work, that you have your default properties assigned to your element via either your ID or your class, or however you target the specific element. Then depending how we want to deploy our animations, we'll find a way to add a class, and we can either elect to keep the class there. So if we only want the animation to run once, we can just keep the class there. But if we want to consistently repeat the animation, we need to remove the class in order to be able to add it again to iterate over the, or not iterate, sorry, but to rerun the animation, which I'm sure we'll be touching on shortly. But that's essentially how Animate.css is utilizing it. And to gain a bit more of an understanding, we'll go visit the documentation on GitHub, as well as get into some code examples. So lucky for us, the documentation over on GitHub's really clear. It's clear and concise is what you could say. So it's got your simple getting started guide. You can ignore this because this is how you would include it if you're using Node. But our basic usage, if you've got your HTML file, so I always recommend that if you're never start a blank HTML project, always clone an HTML5 boilerplate project. So we'll go HTML5 boilerplate. Simply download this, and this is your start. Essentially gives you a starting project exactly like this, and all you do is copy and rename it to the project you want. So always use that as the starting point. Now there's a lot of information here, but you can ignore for the purpose of this demo, but we'll get straight back to it. So it's basically saying to include the animate.css file, we can either download it and have it in our directory, which I did previously, or you can use the hosted version. So you've got CDNs are called content delivery networks, where they've basically got servers all around the world that host this file on, I guess, GitHub's or the vendor's behalf. And by referencing this version of the file, it's basically saying wherever the user's based, it will try ping the closest server to pull the document, so that way they can receive it quicker. So we'll drop that within the head tag of HTML. So that's what's saying here, within the head tag, within the head, include that style sheet. So we save that. Now, I already took the liberty of creating a really simple document. So I've got here a button, a square with class dot. It's just a div with class of square, and a circle with class of circle. So we'll be going through this documentation simply using the simple file here. So as we can see on step 2, it says add the class of animated, and as we saw before, that has the default duration and fill mode. So what we'll be doing to class circle is say animated, and we want to choose our animation type. So we'll also add bounce. Now we should see it bounces. Now what I brushed over earlier is you can also assign a class of infinite, which I think it touches on here, if we want the iteration count to, or if we want the animation to iterate infinitely. So we'll just add that just to show. Oops. So you can see that works. Now in the handcraft example we did, I also did animation direction. Now Animate.css doesn't have that option available, but that's just something that you could code in yourself if required. Cool. So while this is animating away, we'll remove the infinite, and we'll just see what's going on under the hood. So if we load the page, we'll just bring up the push F12 to bring up the developer tools, and we can see we've already declared in the HTML the classes, so they're not being dynamically added. And if we have page load, we can see that it undertook the animation, but the classes have remained. So I guess without getting too technical, we can't actually create another animation by declaring the classes in the HTML like this. So even if we change state, I guess it won't fire another animation, because we essentially need to remove these classes and add them back to be able to fire another animation. So luckily we get given a pretty good example of how to do that using jQuery. So I mean, we're not trying to do a jQuery tutorial here, but I've set up a document here myself. Now, if anyone's used jQuery, you might be familiar with the term add class and remove class. So you can assign a add class and remove class to an event. So for example, we've got a button click event here going on. Now what we can do is we can use the jQuery add class feature to add our animated and our bounce left class. Now I've got your typical document ready function. I've got stored the selectors, jQuery selectors and constants, so we'll just reference that. So we'll do square dot add class. Now this should animated and bounce this should illustrate perfectly what I was trying to, I guess, explain before, is the fact that we did, if I reload the page, I'll highlight the square. So square's doesn't have the animated or the bounce class assigned to it, but by clicking this button and which fires the click event, which then adds a class to the square element that we've got through there in jQuery, you can see here it's added the classes and it's completed the animation as well. But you can see that it actually hasn't removed the classes themselves. So if we click again, we can't fire the animation again because the classes are still there. So we've got to actually remove the class. Now what the documentation has available is, or you can do it via vanilla JavaScript as well, or simply adopting the methodology that's applied here via jQuery, is it's actually got essentially an event listener. So you can assign an event listener which listens for the animation end event. So every time you fire an animation, there's 3 events that are part of the animation. There's the animation start, the animation iteration, which if you have multiple iterations of the animation, that event fires, and an animation end. Now we're not trying to we don't want to go off in that tangent again, but essentially to simply summarize, we've just got this event listener here, which basically binds the event listener once to the relevant element listening for the end of the animation. And again here we've got animation end, but you can see they've got vendor prefixes here on top. So it looks overly complicated, but essentially the one that will make most sense is the animation end. So it's essentially saying once you detect this event once, do something, and then within the do something function, that's when you'd essentially remove the class. So you'd say on the button click, you would say click, add class, and then you'd bind this event listener to the end and say once you hear the animation end, so once the animation has completed, then do something, and within that do something we would say remove class animated bounce. Rather than showing you that on a per element basis using selectors, it's actually better, and they do show you or they've got a good example here of just extending jQuery. So by extending jQuery, you can essentially call a function assigned to or based on a selector. So we'll just remove that and we'll uncomment this, and I'll just show you it again in action. So essentially with our square selector, so we're again selecting the square, we're calling the Animate.css or Animate.css jQuery extended function that we've got here, and within that we're declaring a function that passes in the animation name. So this is what we're passing in, and we could select any animation name from this list. So that's the we're passing in that, and within this function we're simply declaring a variable animation end, which is storing all the vendor prefix animation end event listeners. But moving on to that, we're saying, so once we've got this element selected, or it's bound to this, then we add class of animated. So this is just via string adding the animated class that we need, then also adding the animation name that we've passed through here, the attribute, and then we're also binding the event listener. So once we've added the animation animated and animation class name, we'll bind the event listener, and when that event listener fires as per this do something, so once that do something fires, which is this here, this function, then it's saying this dot remove class. So it's essentially doing what we just spoke about, but allowing us to apply it to any selector. So here we've already stored the square selector and applying it here, but we could also add another, we could reference another element. So we could actually say circle. Actually, before we do that, let's go to the circle and remove these static classes that we added. Circle dot animate CSS Oops. And what should we do? Hinge wouldn't really work for a circle. Let's do flip out Y, just for giggles. It's not working. Why is this not working? Circle, dot circle. Amateur. Typos. There we go, flip out. And because this is going through this process that we've just spoken about, we can click this button as many times as we like. So this broadly covers the idea of class-based animations, and it's actually something you see in a lot of major frameworks. I think React uses it, Angular uses it. Yeah, most of the JavaScript frameworks operate in this way, where at a certain state it adds a class to generate the animation, and then as soon as the animation ends it removes the class. Now there's another way we can actually use Animate.css, and that's using CSS States. So rather than using class-based states, which I guess it's adding the class to the document or to the DOM, it's adding the classes to generate the state, and it's removing them. We can actually use CSS States. So before we kick off, I'll just remove the JavaScript functionality, so that way we can say there's no declared classes here generating animations. The button's not doing anything. Blank canvas essentially. So the way you do CSS state-based animations using Animate.css is you need a preprocessor like sass. So with sass you can include the file without getting into too much how sass works and operates. We can essentially import the file and change the file type to, which I'll do now, to SCSS. And the good thing with sass is you can combine .sass files with .scss files, and the strength of .scss is that it's essentially the same as native CSS, but I prefer to code in .sass without the brackets and semicolons. But enough of that. So once we have that in our directory as a .css SCSS file, we need to import it in, and once we import it in, we can then reference or extend those classes that are available in that file. So we'll remove that and we'll open that. Now in the example I had previous with the, I've got an example of the extend functionality. So it's essentially all the extend does is you're previously declaring a class here. So I've just named something base font, of assign the size, weight, font family, alignment, spacings, color and whatnot, and then for each of the square, circle and button I've just extended that. So it's essentially importing these styles into this selector here. So if we look at app.css and we go you can see here the way it's compiled is that it's applied common themes to all of these selectors. So it's got .font, base font, button.toggle, .square, .circle, but obviously the way we structure it in our code is within the selector there. So we apply that same methodology to I'm just thinking the best way to implement this. Let's just do it like this. Animated fonts dot infinite animated as you can see, we're getting compiling errors, and that is because I haven't imported it. You can see some and that's just the way I image warts and all this one is. There we go. So just a quick recap of what I did there. I've got a this is just the way I create partials within Sass. So I've got a vendor directory. I would usually have like a components and a layouts directory, but here's where you'll add your vendor file. So you've got Animate.css as a vendor file, and then you've just got a directory that imports them all. So within this directory, I just need to import Animate, and then app.sass is the one that imports all of the subdirectories. So that way it flows up the chain to output. And if we then go back to app.css, yes, it's another thing as well that within app.css, because we've imported animate.css, we output the entire animate.css code. Now this opens up, or this will potentially bloat your file size, especially if you're importing CSS frameworks like Bootstrap this way, but it actually gives you more flexibility in terms of because I've got a backup of the file. What I might do is go into, I'm applying the bounce, so everything below bounce, delete. So say for example, if I'm only using the bounce, I only ever plan to use the bounce, I can get rid of, not bouncing in, we're not bouncing out, we're just using bounce. I can get rid of all of these, not using the hinge. Save. No impact, but you can see the size of my CSS out, or the app.css output is dramatically decreased. So it's only got what's relevant. And then if we look at, that's right, it will be, yeah. And a little trick, so when you do extend functionality like this, it outputs there, just the way the selectors are grouped together. But that is a little trick of a way to use Animate.css within CSS States in terms of including it, sorry, but actually I just lied, I said within CSS States. We need an actual CSS state to extend it, right? So true to my word, I shall do that. Now focus state is assigned to a button when it's in focus, and I shall remove the outline none just so you can see that it is in focus. The little in Chrome browsers you get that little blue outline whenever something's in focus, and that is assuming or extending that these animation properties. Sorry, I was just getting a bit confused about something else. But if we don't like it on the focus state, see if actually as soon as we change focus, it loses it, gains it, loses it. And the great thing about CSS States is I don't know exactly how it works, but it somehow removes any memory of the previous animation. So as soon as it loses its state, it can be a bit jerky, but there are ways around it which we won't cover for now. But if we even look at the hover state, if we want to make it bounce when it hovers, now you can see that works, but obviously because it's bouncing so much, I'm actually where my mouse pointer is going outside the element, so I've actually got to track it. But again, there are ways about increasing the element's hover area using pseudo elements and whatnot, but outside the scope of this tutorial. But you can see it works with CSS based states. So we'll leave it to your imagination about how you want to apply it, but I thought I'd show you some of the tools and some of the methods that we can use. So yeah. So yeah, just to summarize, if we actually go back to Animate.css, we've obviously covered the different types of animations that you got for user experience, whether it be interaction based attention seekers or entrances and exits. We've seen how Animate.css itself uses events to assign and remove classes based on jQuery. It's using the jQuery extend function to essentially listen for the animation end function and remove the assigned class names. Speaking of class names, we've also gone over what classes you need to add and remove to get the animation functionality. We've quickly touched over the minimum requirements for the animation CSS property, as well as making a pretty kick-ass demo. Obviously had to wait for the large images because I didn't compress images because they're high quality, but yeah. And we've covered the concept of class-based state management, I suppose you could term it, and how that's done within frameworks plus single page applications, and also extending Animate.css within a CSS preprocessor like Sass, and how we can use it with CSS States. So I think we've covered most bases. It's tried to be as simple as possible, but obviously sometimes you got to go into a little bit of detail to clarify some questions that beginners will ask, because I definitely know that when I was learning, you'd learn a new concept and you'd have a million questions about that little concept, and it sort of prevents you from moving forward. So I thought I'd try to touch as much as possible without going into too much detail. But if you've got any questions, just fire them off in the comments. I'm more than happy to answer them and help you out. And if you need additional resources, I can point you in the right direction, because I've self-taught pretty much all I know in terms of referencing other YouTube videos or great blogs or other tutorials. So yeah, it's all doable. It's just practice and repetition. So without further ado, thanks for joining me, and we'll catch you next time. See ya.